The date was March 9th, 1944, and I was flying as a line navigator on Jim Tyson's crew with the 535th Squadron of the 381st Bomb Group out of Ridgewell, England. We had just finished our third mission to Berlin in the past 4 days, and were a little weary about repeatedly going to this target. Losses were the heaviest for any raid made by the 8th Air Force during the entire war on March 6th, when 69 bombers failed to return. On March 8th, 37 bombers were lost. However, on March 9th, things improved and only 8 bombers were missing in action. Bomber crew members lost in action on these 3 missions totaled 1,040 men. At my insistence, Jim broke radio silence on 2 occasions. The first occasion was on the March 6th raid, when the lead plane deviated from the flight plan. He led the formation over Osnabrück, and 1 plane was knocked down by flak unnecessarily. I requested a return to the flight plan. The second occasion was on the March 9th raid. We flew over a solid cloud cover from the time we assembled over England and were fighting a stout headwind of unknown intensity all the way to the target. When I asked for a coded position report from the lead Pathfinder plane, our request was denied, and we were royally chewed out by the group commander at debriefing following each of these missions. The group had a stand down that evening. At 2100 hours, we were informed the group commander wanted to see us in his office. We expected to get chewed out again for breaking radio silence over enemy territory. Instead, Jim Tyson and I were offered a transfer to the Pathfinder force of the 1st Bomb Division of the 8th Air Force, then stationed with the 305th Bomb Group at Chelveston. Jim Tyson and I talked it over a few minutes and accepted the offer. 1 other crew from the 381st Bomb Group was offered the same opportunity. Carl Clark was the pilot and Clem Obler the navigator. During the next 6 weeks, we occasionally flew deep penetration missions leading the 381st Bomb Group and our Pathfinder B-17. The Pathfinder planes had the latest navigation equipment available at that time. This included a G-box for the Dead Reckoning, also called the DR Navigator, in the nose of the ship. The British G system was developed by an electronic wizard named Robert J. Dippy. It was first proposed in 1937, while he was working on the radar defense shield for Great Britain with Robert Watson Watt. However, his proposal was placed in the so-called icebox until 1941. Drastic improvements in navigation tools were needed, since only 10% of British bombers were able to find their nighttime targets. Dippy's G for grid system was retrieved from the icebox. Within 18 months, the system was being successfully used by the RAF, and by January 1944, American bombers were also being outfitted with his so-called G-box. The G system required at least 2 sets of radio stations transmitting pulse radio signals. The stations were called the Master and the Slave Station. These stations were usually positioned about 70 miles apart, and the distance was measured with extreme accuracy. The master station first transmitted the signal that traveled to the slave station that said, "Trigger a pulse release." The electronic wizards knew radio waves traveled at a speed of approximately 5 microseconds, or 5 millionths of a second per mile. They allowed 350 microseconds for the signal to reach a slave station 70 miles away, plus a few extra microseconds lost in the triggering action. Then, with phenomenal time delay accuracy, the master station also triggered a pulse at exactly the same instant. Of course, they used accurate speeds for the radio waves instead of approximations. When the aircraft received the pulses transmitted by the master and slave stations, an on-board oscilloscope determined the difference in time of arrival of the two signals in microseconds. This difference is represented as the live blip shown above the upper timeline. The lower blip is a controllable marker blip. By aligning the left leading edges of the upper and lower blips and throwing a switch, the navigator can determine the value of the live blip and the red parabolic curve. In the example shown, the upper timeline represents the red grid system of the G-chart, and the value of the live blip is red 23.4. This means the aircraft is located on the hyperbolic curve or red G line numbered 23.4. Another observation was made from a second set of radio stations, for example, the green grid, whose pulse transmissions appeared on the lower timeline of the G-box. The difference in time of arrival of these two signals placed the aircraft on a second hyperbolic curve of the green grid system. In this example, the value is green 33.8. The position of the aircraft was at the intersection of the red 23.4 G line and the green 33.8 G line. Time required to take a fix was about 15 seconds. Accuracy was excellent, usually about 25 feet at sea level. However, in the hands of an experienced pilot navigator team, the G-box could bring a bomber home to a safe landing in a pea soup English fog. Most people are unfamiliar with the cavity magnetron. It was developed in 1940 by Harry Boot and John Randall at the University of Birmingham in England. It was the breakthrough needed to develop airborne radar and, incidentally, to create microwaves for home usage. Boot and Randall found that the cavity magnetron enabled them to generate 100 times more power for the output of microwaves required for radar reflections. The first airborne radar built by the British was called the H-2S radar. Scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology worked at upgrading the British version and developed an improved version called the H-2X radar. Our Pathfinder ship had an H-2X radar set located in the radio room. The operator was known to all as the Mickey operator. The image generated by the H-2X was primitive by today's standards, as may be seen in this radar image of the Thames estuary. A few ships are visible. However, it may also be noted that the line of demarcation between water and land is excellent. We did not have a bombardier assigned to our crew. The bombardier was always supplied by the group we were scheduled to lead. The Pathfinder ships also lacked a ball turret gunner, since the space was taken up with the radar dome for the H-2X radar. This white plastic globe was commonly called the fishbowl. Well-trained technicians kept the G-box and H-2X radar in top shape, and we seldom had any problems with malfunctioning equipment. Much of our time during the next 6 weeks period was spent practicing timed turns. Since we were leading formations as large as 54 B-17s, all turns had to be slow and consistent. Jim Tyson finally established his standard turning rate at 1/4 needle width on the turn and bank indicator. I knew that this turn would require 4 minutes to swing through 180 degrees with a turning radius of 4 miles. This timing was a big help to me, as we were required to hit departure and checkpoints on time. Unnecessary turns were bad news for these huge formations, and both Jim and I quickly vetoed the double drift method of obtaining wind data. We devised our own method to establish wind direction and velocity using G-fixes while making a straight and level flight of 6 minutes. The addition of the H-2X radar was also a big help to me in my position as lead navigator. A good Mickey operator could make sense out of the jumble of red dots he saw on his radar screen and provide me with accurate fixes when the ground was obscured by clouds. The H-2X radar was not very good at identifying various sections of a city, such as Berlin, but it did an excellent job showing the line of demarcation between land and water. On May 1st, 1944, the Pathfinder force of the 1st Bomb Division was transferred to Bassingbourn, home of the 91st Bomb Group. Pathfinder teams were kept busy during the month prior to D-Day on deep penetrations into Germany. During May of 1944, we led 2 raids to Berlin, 1 to Kiel, 1 to Ludwigshafen, and another attacking petroleum targets in the Dessau-Leipzig area. Further, we were alerted 6 additional times, but the missions were scrubbed at the last minute, and we had to return to our home base at Bassingbourn, often in bad weather. May 29th saw a big change in our schedule. All 1st Bomb Division Pathfinder teams stationed at Bassingbourn were ordered to camera bomb a jetty located in the town of Skegness on the so-called Wash of central England. Our instructions were quite clear. First, the navigator placed the aircraft on a G-line that ran through our target. By interpolation and measuring the distance between green G-lines 42.40 and 42.50, we find that the G-line through the jetty is 42.42. This is the G-line I will use to make the attack. I set my bunker blip at 42.42. When the live blip of the cathode ray tube drifted right or left of the marker blip, the navigator would call the pilot and give course corrections. Second, during early phases of the attack, the pilot and navigator worked together to establish the flight path of the aircraft so that it followed the G-line selected by the navigator. When the target came into range of the Norden bomb site, The Bombardier took over lateral control of the aircraft from the pilot and made necessary course corrections through the bomb sight that was tied into the AFCE, or automatic flight control equipment, of the aircraft. Third, the Mickey operator, using the H-2X radar, measured the range or distance to the target and relayed this information to the Bombardier on a continuing basis. The beach line of demarcation came in sharp and clear on the scope of the H-2X radar. The navigator also furnished the Bombardier with wind at altitude information so that an accurate ground speed could be used to determine the point of bomb release. Fourth, the Bombardier cranked all basic data into the Norden bomb sight, including our 15,000-foot altitude from his radar altimeter. This included course, ground speed, true airspeed, temperature, drift, and range or distance to the target. As the indices of the Norden bomb sight moved towards the release point, the Bombardier would continually crank in latest distance to the target data received from the Mickey operator, as well as course corrections received from the navigator. The weather was clear and the Bombardier could see the target. However, he was instructed not to bomb visually, but to follow directions from the navigator and Mickey operator until the bomb release point, at which point the camera would be activated to determine the position of the bomb strike. I was not pleased with the results shown by my strike photos. The range was excellent. Mickey was right on target and the bomb strike was right on the shoreline. However, the strike was spotted about 200 feet right of the jetty I was aiming for. We spent 5 hours camera bombing that jetty, but my G-lines always carried us 200 to 300 feet right of the target. 2 days later, on May 31st, we were again sent back to bomb the jetty at Skegness. We spent another 5 hours practicing, but my G-line always brought us about 200 feet right of the jetty. In retrospect, this is understandable, since G reportedly had an accuracy of plus or minus 25 feet at sea level. We were flying at an altitude of 15,000 feet, and those radio waves had to travel horizontally as well as vertically almost 3 miles to reach my G-box. It was that vertical distance that was causing my problem. Of course, we reported our results back to base, but no one seemed to be concerned about the 200-foot horizontal discrepancy I had observed in my G-line. We didn't know it at the time, but we were practicing for the invasion, and the primary concern of my superiors was our ability to hit the beach line accurately. John Sperling, our Mickey operator, had done an excellent job. Perhaps our superiors knew we would be bombing with 3 elements of 6 bombers in a shallow V formation. The width of the formation from outside wingtip to outside wingtip was about 1,400 feet. Hence, a 200-foot horizontal shift was of little concern, as long as the bombs hit the beach line and not our troops. The following evening, about 7 p.m., on June 1st, 1944, we were alerted. Jim Tyson and Carl Clark were to fly to Ridgewell to lead the 381st Bomb Group. Our preliminary briefing was for a gun battery on the coast in the Pas-de-Calais area. At first we thought the invasion was on, but we were assured that it was not. We flew to the 381st Bomb Group at Ridgewell and landed about midnight. At briefing the following morning, 2 groups of 18 planes each were formed. Jim Tyson led the A group and Carl Clark led the B group. We didn't know it at the time, but Pas-de-Calais was part of Eisenhower's diversionary strategy. Apparently, our job was to make a big noise with our 500-pound, 1,000-pound, and 2,000-pound bombs. We attacked over a solid cloud cover from an altitude of 22,000 feet and used the combination G-H-2X radar attack we had practiced for 2 days, bombing the jetty at Skegness. Carl Clark's navigator was Clem Obler. We roomed together in the navigator's quarters at Bassingbourn. Late that evening, after the mission, an orderly advised Clem that he was flying a mission. For a change, I got to stay home. Clem cussed a little, and I urged him to go out and win the war for me, Clem, and promptly fell asleep. About an hour later, the same orderly returned and said, "Lieutenant Howland, get up. Lieutenant Obler crashed on takeoff, and you have to fly his mission." In an emotional outburst brought on by gut-tearing apprehension, I yelled at the orderly, "What happened? Tell me what happened." The excited orderly replied, "A bomb truck and trailer stalled in the center of the runway while they were taking off. They barely got the plane in the air before they hit it. The right landing gear was wiped out and they lost number 3 engine, but they did manage to stay airborne. They have a full load of gas on board, but no bombs. Right now, they are flying around to use up their gasoline before they come in for a crash landing." Greatly relieved to hear that Carl Clark was able to get the plane into the air, I reached for my clothes and started dressing. I was still worried about Clem, who, like me, always rides in the nose of the ship at takeoff. However, by the time we reached the flight line, Carl Clark had radioed back that all on board were safe, so I was able to take off and fly Clem's mission with my mind at ease. The mission to gun batteries in the Pas-de-Calais area was practically the same as the one we flew yesterday, and bombing was through the clouds once more. After our return to Bassingbourn, we found that Carl Clark had made a perfect one-wheel landing, and all on board were safe. We also learned the scary details of their ordeal. Under wartime rules, Carl took off without the use of landing lights. All he had for guidelines were the hooded runway lights. He never saw the truck he slammed into shortly after liftoff. The crash wiped out the right landing gear and knocked 24 inches off the number 3 propeller blade, throwing it horribly out of balance. The engines were exerting full takeoff power, and the props were turning over at approximately 2,000 revolutions per minute, or 33 revolutions per second. The instantaneous loss of 24 inches from one propeller blade threw the engine violently out of balance. The entire aircraft shook furiously. The severe vibration ruptured a hydraulic line in the cockpit. At very high pressure, the red sticky hydraulic fluid sprayed out, covering the instrument panel, windows, and everything else in the cockpit. The vibration was so severe, instruments were useless. Miraculously, Carl flew by the seat of his pants in pitch black darkness until, by gut instinct, he isolated the problem, shut down the number 3 engine, and feathered the prop. The horrible vibration ceased. Eager helping hands then wiped the instrument panel clear, and he regained full control of the plane. Later, a low-level overflight of the tower was made, and a powerful searchlight showed the dangling, useless right landing gear. The decision was made to make a one-wheel landing in an effort to save the precious H-2X radar on this Pathfinder plane. Carl circled the base for 9 hours to use up gasoline and brought it into a perfect, non-destructive one-wheel landing. The H-2X radar was undamaged. Colonel Henry Terry, the base commander, was there to greet him and congratulate Carl. He also promoted him to captain on the spot. The following day, June 4th, we were back in action again. Carl Clark and Clem Ober were also put to work flying the lead Pathfinder plane for the 381st Bomb Group. We flew deputy lead for our close friends and colleagues. Despite the harrowing ordeal they went through the previous day, Carl and Clem did a perfect job leading the 381st Bomb Group as we bombed gun emplacements in the Pas-de-Calais area through the clouds using the same technique we had practiced at Skegness. On June 5th, Jim Tyson's crew was ordered to fly to the 398th Bomb Group at Nut Hampstead and lead them attacking gun batteries on the Normandy coast. For a change, the target was visible and we bombed using the Norden bomb site. As usual, we were interrogated and debriefed at our home base of Bassingbourn and immediately went to bed about 1800 hours. We were awakened just 90 minutes later. Pathfinder crews were ordered to attend a preliminary briefing session with our Pathfinder Squadron Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Weizenfeld. As we sat in the briefing room, the first words I heard were, "This is it." We knew it meant invasion, but we didn't know where it was to take place. We took off from Bassingbourn with about 17 other Pathfinder crews, flying to bomb groups in the 1st Bomb Division. 3 of us, Clark, Tyson, and 1 other PFF team, headed for the 381st Bomb Group at Ridgewell. We didn't get any sleep and received our final briefing at 1:30 hours. Security was extremely tight. Only pilots, navigators, and bombardiers were allowed in the briefing room. All persons briefed were pledged to secrecy until the planes were in the air and the mission was underway. Only then could locations of the target be released to the crew. In a maximum strength effort, the 381st put up 2 groups of 18 planes, with a Pathfinder team leading each group. Lieutenant Colonel Conway Hall was the acting wing commander of the A Group and flew in the co-pilot seat of our plane. Jim Tyson was the Pathfinder pilot, and I was the Pathfinder navigator. John Sperling, the 3rd member of our Pathfinder team, was the Mickey, or H-2X radar operator, and Charlie Eager from the 381st Bomb Group was the bombardier. The Pathfinder team of Carl Clark and Clem Obler led the B Group of 18 planes. Their target was an airport in the St. Lo area. The bomb load for our group on June 6th was 100-pound high-explosive demolition bombs. We carried only 20 high-explosive bombs and 2 smoke bombs in our Pathfinder plane. The rest of the planes carried 36 high-explosive 100-pound bombs. The lightweight bombs seemed almost puny by comparison with the 2,000, 1,000, and 500-pound bombs we had dropped on Pas-de-Calais on June 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and Normandy gun emplacements on June 5th. Our principal target, June 6th, D-Day, was a gun battery on the beach due north of the town of Bayeux. Our formation consisted of 18 planes in a shallow V of V's, about 1/4 mile wide. There was little likelihood our total of 630 diminutive 100-pound bombs scattered along a 1/4 mile stretch of beach would wipe out a reinforced concrete gun battery. However, we were told the 100-pound bombs were supposed to make foxholes for the troops. The weather looked bad, and we were given strict orders to make certain our bombs did not fall short. Our assigned target was the Gold Beach, and we were flying in support of British and Canadian troops. With upwards of 10,000 aircraft competing for the airspace over England and the coast of France, we were forcefully instructed to follow the flight plan and hit our checkpoints on time. The weather report indicated clouds over the invasion coast. I was issued the Pembroke-Paris G chart to plot the attack using the combination G H2X radar procedure we had practiced at Skegness and also used to bomb targets near Calais. At that time, I was unaware that most of the naval vessels were using the east-west grid system shown in this illustration covering the channel, but not inland targets. Reportedly, this chart was more accurate than the Pembroke-Paris chart and enabled ships to follow the lanes cleared of mines. Further, they stayed on assigned courses, avoiding collisions in the dark of night between blacked-out naval vessels. The value of G to the success of D-Day has been largely unreported. However, one naval veteran put things in proper perspective when he said, "They should not have called it D-Day, they should have called it G-Day." He has a valid point, for it was G that safely guided more than 1,000 planes through cloudy skies and 1,000 blacked-out ships through a dark, stormy night in the crowded, narrow English Channel. I was also unaware of the fact that the strength of the G-pulse signals was dramatically boosted on D-Day to overcome German attempts to jam the signals. It was my personal observation that the G signals were very strong, and I had no interference from German jamming while making the bomb run. The assembly went off smoothly and on time. Our months of practice and training in formation assembly paid off. We left Beachy Head on time and headed south and west across the English Channel to pick up a G line that would guide us into the target. Mickey operator John Sperling said his radar scope was full of reflections from hundreds of boats in the channel. However, we could not see the boats due to the solid layer of clouds below us. As mentioned previously, the chart I used was the Pembroke-Paris G chart. I studied the chart trying to determine the best G station to use in the attack. The purple station was one option and came in loud and clear on the G-scope. However, the hyperbolic curves crossed the beach at an angle from the northwest. The G lines of the green station crossed the beach line target area ideally at a right angle. However, I would be working with the eastern edge of the green grid and wasn't sure about reception. On checking, I found the green signal came in loud and clear on the G-box, and there was no sign of enemy jamming. I made the decision to attack using the green G and set the marker blip at 32.09. At our 15,000-foot bombing altitude, we had a solid undercast and were forced to use the GH2X procedure practiced at Skegness. I had my eyes glued to the blips of the G-box, keeping us on a true course of 180 degrees. John Sperling gave range and ground speed data to the bombardier, who cranked the information into his Norden bomb sight. Sperling also assured me that the H2X radar showed the town of Bayou was dead ahead on the course I had selected. This greatly boosted my confidence in the green G line I was using. Charlie Eager, our bombardier from the 381st Bomb Group, looked for a break in the clouds so he could take over visually, but it never came. Nevertheless, our training paid off. We had confidence the G-box course line was reasonably accurate, and our practice bombing sessions had proved the Mickey operator and bombardier could hit the beach line with good accuracy. We did what we were trained to do, and did it to the best of our ability, with full confidence in our equipment and procedures. Bombs were dropped at 0704. 0 hour for landings on the British-Canadian sector of Gold Beach below us was 21 minutes later at 0725 hours. At bombs away, I left the scope of my G-box and came up for air and to look out my window. But all I could see was a solid undercast and one solitary puff of black smoke in the sky. The collision and accidental explosion of 200-pound bombs evidently made this mark as they tumbled earthward and collided in midair. There was no enemy flak over the beaches or after bombs away. Evidently the Germans were saving or using their ammunition on other targets. The target of Carl Clark and Clem Obler was an airport near St. Lo. While making his attack at St. Lo, Clem started the approach using G. Like our formation, they were not bothered with German flak. As they flew into the target area, Carl brought the formation down to 10,000 feet. They gained contact with the ground, and the bombardier took over visually. Clem abandoned the G-box and leaned over the bombardier, watching the aiming point hangar area of the airport with binoculars. Clem describes the action that followed. A German truck or weapons carrier came roaring across the tarmac at high speed. I could see the faces of two men clearly as they looked up at us. They came to a screeching halt at the hangar, and one man jumped out to open a door. He jumped back into the truck and they drove inside. Just then our bomb struck the hangar and blew it to pieces. As Clem put it, the air war becomes quite personal at lower altitudes. In our formation, we didn't see many Allied bombers and no enemy aircraft at all. All bomber formations were routed in, line astern. After the target, we had to fly a traffic pattern south across the Cherbourg Peninsula, then a right turn flying about 75 miles west, and then another right turn flying due north past the Jersey and Guernsey Islands and back to base. It was a thrilling occasion, but for our crew it was a very easy raise. There was no need for the extra boxes of ammunition we had stashed throughout the plane. We didn't see a single enemy fighter. There was no flak over the target or along our route. Breaking with Pathfinder 4 standard operating procedures, we did not return to Bassingbourn but landed at Ridgewell about 10:30 hours and were debriefed. The aircraft were again loaded with bombs and service to fly another mission. The lead crews of Jim Tyson and Carl Clark were confined to the operations building. Rumors were rampant, including one that in the event the invasion went badly, B-17s would be used at low altitudes to drop fragmentation bombs and strafe. The rumors really didn't bother us. However, the lack of sleep for more than 30 hours was wearing us down. We made pallets of flak vests and sheepskin-lined flight suits, and using partially inflated Bay West life vests for pillows, we went to sleep on the floor of the equipment room. A 381st Squadron commander awakened us at 1600 hours. The afternoon mission had been scrubbed, and we were instructed to return to Bassingbourn. A total of 1,622 effective missions were flown by the 8th Air Force heavy bombers on June 6th. These bombers dropped a total of 4,852 tons of bombs in support of the troops. Only 4 heavy bombers were lost on this date. To place things in proper perspective, the 36 B-17s from the 381st Bomb Group involved in these 2 attacks represented only 2.2% of the 8th Air Force heavy bombers flying out of 36 heavy bomb groups in England. Some of the attacks were more successful than ours, others were less productive. Nevertheless, the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force made substantial contributions and greatly assisted our troops fighting below. Of course, our concern for the troops below was real, and we worried about dropping short and hitting our allies. I was never able to contact any of the men who hit the beaches north of Bayou to find out what the results of our bombing amounted to. The only account I have been able to locate was in a book titled Invasion, They're Coming by Paul Carrell and published by E.P. Dutton and Company in New York City in 1963. Carrell describes the actions of German soldiers of General Richter's 716th Infantry Division, which was responsible for defense of a coastal sector 21 miles long north of Bayou. On page 90, Carrell describes the experiences of a German soldier named Corporal Berenson. Berenson's machine gun post was half buried in sand. Berenson himself had been wounded. The telephone was somewhere underneath the sand and could no longer transmit any orders. But then, what use would the telephone have been, since all the wires had been broken by the aerial bombardment anyway? There was no contact left between companies, battalions, and regiments of 716th Division. As a fighting unit, the 716th Division had been smashed by the murderous aerial and naval bombardment. Apparently, we did the job we were supposed to do.